The Sorting Hat touched his ears like a second, older mind closing around the shape of his skull. For one suspended instant, Harry saw nothing at all of the great hall, the candles, the upturned faces. He saw instead the narrow dark of a cupboard, the quick instinct to listen for footsteps before breathing too loudly, the long practice of making himself useful before anyone could make him small. He had never thought of those things as ambition. He had thought of them as survival. "Ah," said the Hat in a voice that seemed to come from the seams of his own thoughts. "There you are." Harry gripped the edge of the stool. Not Slytherin, he thought at once, because Hagrid's warning still rang in him and because Draco Malfoy's pleased expression at dinner on the train had attached itself, in Harry's mind, to everything cold and superior he had already learned to distrust. The Hat gave a soft little chuckle. Such quick refusals from a boy who watches before he speaks. "You have courage, certainly. More than enough for Gryffindor. But courage is not the first thing you use. You measure. You adapt. You remember insults. You know the value of never being powerless again." "Nani?" Harry felt as if it had opened a locked door inside him and peered in without permission. "I don't want to be like him," Harry thought fiercely, and knew the Hat would understand he meant Draco, Vernon, Dudley. Every larger person who had discovered that fear could be used as a leash. "Wanting power and wanting cruelty are not the same desire," said the Hat. "You could do very well in Slytherin. Better than you know. You would learn what the world is made of before it tries to teach you by force. There is hunger in you, Harry Potter. Not for applause. For safety. For belonging. For a place no one can shut you out of." "No." The great hall waited. Harry could feel the weight of it. Anywhere but. The Hat became very quiet. Then, almost gently, it said, "The question is not what other people have made of a house. The question is what you might make of it." Something in Harry stilled. He did not like Draco. He did not trust the stories he had heard. But he understood with an ugly little twist of honesty. That part of him wanted whatever knowledge might keep him from ever being trapped again. And if the Hat had heard that wanting, then perhaps refusing it would not make it disappear. "All right," Harry thought, before fear could change his mind. The Hat shouted the answer into the hall. "Slytherin." The reaction came in layers. The Slytherin table burst first into applause. Some delighted, some calculating, all startled into unity by the enormity of it. Draco Malfoy clapped hardest of all, his pale face lit with immediate triumph, as if the house had just been handed a prize no one else deserved. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley looked stricken. Hermione Granger's mouth parted in surprise so complete it had no malice in it. Hagrid, visible through the open doors near the back, blinked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Professor Snape's expression did not change much. Yet Harry, walking toward the green and silver banners, had the oddest sense that the potions master had been expecting something of this kind all along. Dumbledore on the high table wore the look he had worn when speaking to Harry in his office much later in life. Amused, thoughtful, and faintly sad, as though he could already see how many consequences were unfurling from a single word. The applause pressed against Harry as he sat down. Draco seized the seat beside him at once. "I knew it," he said, and his satisfaction was so naked that Harry nearly laughed. "I said you didn't belong with those people on the train." Harry thought of Ron sharing sweets without asking for anything in return, and did not answer. Crabbe and Goyle loomed opposite, both grinning like boys who had been promised a larger dinner. Pansy Parkinson looked Harry over with the frank appraisal of someone deciding whether he was a trophy, a curiosity, or a future disappointment. Millicent Bulstrode merely nodded once and returned to her food. They all wanted something from him already. Glory, influence, reflected importance. A story they could tell later about how quickly the famous boy had understood where he truly belonged. Harry, who had spent most of his life wanting no one to notice him at all, found the experience exhausting. The Slytherin dormitories lay behind a stretch of black lake wall where dim waterlight moved over stone like thought across a guarded face. Harry had never seen anything so beautiful and so cold at once. The common room glowed green under hanging lamps. Silver caught on carved chair arms and heavy curtains. It looked less like a home than a place built for people who intended to be impressive even when alone. He unpacked in silence while Draco discoursed on bloodlines, Quidditch, and the stupidity of Hufflepuffs. Theodore Nott watched from the bed opposite with unreadable dark eyes. Far off in the girls' stairwell, someone laughed, a sharp, knowing sound. Harry thought suddenly of the warm red of the Gryffindor hangings, and felt absurdly, as though he had lost something he had never possessed. The next morning proved worse. Gryffindors stared at him over breakfast as if he had personally engineered their disappointment. A Hufflepuff boy whispered to another that fame clearly did not improve judgment. Ravenclaws looked fascinated in a way that made Harry feel pinned to a board. Only Ron, passing with a jug of pumpkin juice, paused long enough to mutter, "Doesn't matter, does it?" in a tone that suggested he was still deciding whether he believed that himself. "It seems to matter to everyone else," Harry muttered back. Ron pulled a face. "Everyone else is thick." Hermione, trailing behind with 3 books hugged to her chest, opened her mouth as if to offer something sensible, saw half the hall watching and closed it again. The moment passed. Yet Harry noticed that she left a library schedule on the bench near him later, folded to the times first years were least likely to be bothered. It was not friendship yet. It was an attempt, and at Hogwarts that turned out to be worth more than many larger gestures. Their first potions lesson made the lines even clearer. Snape swept into the dungeon like a darker part of the room becoming animate. The class snapped to attention. Harry had already learned that fear and admiration were often difficult to distinguish in Slytherin. Snape took the register without looking up, reached Harry Potter, and allowed just enough pause for the name to settle over the benches like smoke. "Our new celebrity," he said softly. A few students laughed. Draco straightened, eager. Harry felt the old instinct from Privet Drive rise clean and cold. Do not flinch where a bully can see it. Snape's questions came like thrown knives. Asphodel and Wormwood. The Bezoar. Monkshood and Wolfsbane. Harry knew none of the answers and said so plainly. There was a stir of delighted discomfort around the room. Snape's black gaze lingered on him for a beat longer than necessary, then shifted. "If fame has not improved your preparation," he said, "perhaps your house will." It was not kindness. It was not approval. Yet in the odd arithmetic of Slytherin, it sounded almost like a challenge offered in good faith. And Harry found himself wanting, against every expectation, to meet it. By the end of the week, he understood the first rule of his new life. The sorting had not told the castle who he was. It had told the castle which version of him it wished to believe in. Every corridor now required him to answer that belief, to resist it, or to use it. Harry did not yet know which response would matter most. He only knew that everyone was watching to see which one he chose. Within a fortnight, Harry had learned that Slytherin admired quickness almost as much as it admired pedigree, but it liked quickness best when it could be directed against someone else. Draco Malfoy, who had expected immediate allegiance from the most famous boy in school, began to understand with increasing irritation that Harry's politeness concealed a talent for refusal. It happened first in small ways. Draco mocked Justin Finch-Fletchley's manners. Harry changed the subject. Draco suggested that Neville Longbottom should be grateful whenever somebody stronger instructed him in the realities of life. Harry asked whether strength always needed an audience. Draco laughed, because Slytherins laughed when cornered, but the skin around his eyes tightened. By the time October wind began to knife across the grounds, they had settled into a relationship too useful to be called enmity and too wary to be called friendship. Harry's refuge, unexpectedly, became work. Potions suited him because it rewarded the same quiet concentration that had once helped him survive Vernon Dursley's moods. Transfiguration fascinated him because McGonagall made no allowance for reputation, good or ill. Charms went better once Hermione Granger stopped hissing corrections from the edge of his vision, and began saving them for after class in the library, where Ron would sprawl across a chair and pretend not to be listening while learning everything alongside. Their meetings were irregular and secretive enough to feel criminal. House boundaries made ordinary friendship a public statement. Harry had already been turned into enough statements for one lifetime. Flying lessons changed things again. Madam Hooch's whistles split the afternoon. Brooms rose, wobbled, dipped. Neville Longbottom, after one terrified kick too many, shot upward like a startled cork and came down in a tangle of limbs and broken dignity. While Madam Hooch marched him toward the hospital wing, Draco scooped up Neville's dropped Remembrall and held it high, the glass globe flashing red in the sun. "Maybe I'll leave it in a tree," he called. Something in Harry went instantly hard. He had seen that expression too often on Dudley's face to mistake it now. Without thinking, he mounted his broom and kicked off. He heard a few shocked cries below, felt the sudden rightness of air beneath him, saw Draco's grin falter as Harry rose higher than any first year was supposed to. Draco flung the Remembrall. Harry dived after it. The wind tore tears from his eyes. For one bright second, the globe seemed impossible to catch. Then his fingers closed around it and he pulled up so neatly that even the Slytherins cheered. On the ground there was chaos. Madam Hooch outraged, Draco furious, Pansy delighted, Ron shouting something that might have been brilliant or idiotic. More surprisingly, Marcus Flint appeared from the castle with Professor Snape in tow. Flint's heavy-featured face broke into a grin. "Do that again," he said, "and I'll have a place for you." Snape's gaze ran over Harry, measuring, speculative. "Mr. Higgs has a shoulder strain," he said at last, as though this explained everything. "Captain Flint may find a temporary replacement useful." That evening, the Slytherin common room treated Harry less like an imported curiosity, and more like house property of exceptional value. Terence Higgs, whose injury had evidently become convenient rather than debilitating, looked at Harry with frank resentment. Draco, who had expected the day to end with Harry humiliated, was in a temper sharp enough to cut through conversation. The midnight duel challenge arrived folded in green and silver parchment, delivered by Crabbe with theatrical secrecy. Draco proposed the trophy room at midnight. Wands only. Seconds welcome. Harry suspected a trap at once. He was less certain, annoyingly, about whether refusing it would hand Draco precisely the victory he wanted. Ron found him in a passage near the Great Hall before curfew and seized his sleeve. "It's Filch," he said. "Fred and George heard Malfoy talking. He means to have you caught." Harry ought to have been touched that Ron had bothered. Instead, he found himself irritated by the pounding of his own pride. "I know it's a trap." "Then don't go." Hermione, who had appeared apparently from the stone itself, fixed both of them with the expression she reserved for boys about to make history through stupidity. "This is absurd," she whispered. "All of it is absurd. It should have ended there." Yet an hour later, Harry was under the invisibility of night, rather than cloak, slipping from Slytherin with Ron at his heels, and Hermione following, because somebody, she said furiously, had to ensure the school did not burn down around their terrible judgment. Neville, locked out by an unfortunately misplaced password, joined them by accident and then by panic. There was no Draco in the trophy room. There was, however, Peeves, who saw 4 frightened first years and announced them to the corridor with delighted volume. Filch answered from far too near. They ran. The castle at night became another creature entirely. All blind corners and moving shadows. They fled up one staircase, down another, through a door Harry knew at once they should not have opened, and into a room that smelled of dog and old fur. The creature inside lifted 3 heads and opened 6 eyes. Fluffy, as Hagrid later called him, had 3 separate mouths full of teeth long enough to shame the cutlery. Beneath his paws lay a trapdoor. Harry shut the door so hard the hinges screamed. The 4 of them sprinted until the corridor ended and then stood panting, pressed together against cold stone, staring at one another in the dawning knowledge that something at Hogwarts was being guarded by a dog no sensible person would ever choose unless they expected the thing beneath him to tempt the desperate and the reckless alike. Hermione recovered first. "If any of you tell anyone I was running with you," she said in a trembling voice, "I shall deny it on principle." Ron started laughing. It came out half hysterical. Neville joined in because terror had stripped him of alternatives. Even Harry found himself laughing too, the sound weak and real and strangely grateful. Afterward, as they crept back toward their separate common rooms, Ron said into the darkness, "Doesn't seem to matter much what house you're in when you've nearly been eaten." For the first time since the sorting, Harry thought that might actually be true. By Halloween, the school had adjusted to the novelty of Harry Potter and Slytherin without ceasing to find uses for it. Gryffindors had decided he was either a victim or a traitor, sometimes within the same conversation. Slytherins had decided he was proof that greatness naturally drifted toward them unless interfered with by sentimental adults. Ravenclaws treated him like an experiment with excellent hair. Hufflepuffs, perhaps wisest of all, mostly let him alone. Harry found that the freedom of being misunderstood in every direction was peculiar and exhausting. He ate often with his own house and trusted very few of them. He studied with Hermione in the library and flew with Ron on windswept afternoons whenever the pitch was empty and neither of their housemates could turn it into a quarrel. The arrangement would have been impossible if they had named it. Since they did not, it survived. Hermione remained the central strain in that survival. She did not know how to be less correct than she was, and the boys did not know how to be corrected without considering it a private injury. The quarrel that sent everything tipping into disaster came after Charms, when Ron emerged from class bruised in pride by another day of hearing how much better Harry might do if he remembered the exact wand movement rather than an approximation. "She's a nightmare," Ron muttered as they descended the stairs. "Honestly, no wonder nobody can stand." He stopped because Harry had gone abruptly still. Hermione stood on the landing above them, books crushed against her chest, face gone blotchy with humiliation. For once, she had no words at all. She turned and fled. Ron looked sick at once. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did," Harry said, though not cruelly. He knew too much about words spoken carelessly, and heard too clearly by those already looking for confirmation that they did not belong. "You just didn't think she'd hear." At the Halloween feast, Hermione's place remained empty. Harry noticed because he kept expecting her hand to appear from nowhere and confiscate the extra treacle tart he had stolen from Ron's plate. Ron noticed because each moment he did not apologize made the thing harder to fix. The great hall swelled with food, ghosts, chatter, orange light. Then Professor Quirrell burst in, turban askew, and gasped a warning about a troll in the dungeons before fainting dead away. Panic broke over the hall like weather. Prefects shouted. Benches scraped. Students were marshaled toward dormitories in clumps and streams. Harry, swept halfway toward the Slytherin table's assigned exit, stopped so suddenly that Draco nearly collided with him. "Granger," Harry said. Draco stared. "What about her?" "She's in the bathroom. She doesn't know." Draco's expression hardened into disbelief. "And?" Harry did not waste time answering. He broke from the line. Ron was beside him before he reached the doors. The troll's smell hit first, a rancid wall of drains and damp. Its footsteps trembled through the flagstones. They heard a scream from the girls' bathroom and ran harder. What happened next remained in Harry's memory less as a sequence than as a series of blindingly clear fragments. Hermione backed against the sinks with a hand over her mouth, the troll swinging its club and smashing porcelain into white rain. Ron's voice cracking on a spell that should have failed and did not. Harry leaping onto the troll's back with a wild, pointless courage that would later make him blush. The club jerking free under Ron's levitation charm and falling with a sickening thud under its... Then silence, except for the drip of water and all three of them breathing much too fast. Teachers arrived at once. McGonagall in tartan fury, Snape limping, Quirrell gray with fright. Hermione found her courage before any of the boys found theirs. She stepped forward and lied. She told Professor McGonagall she had come after the troll because she thought she could manage it. She told her that Harry and Ron had not gone looking for trouble, only for her. It was absurd. It was transparent. It worked anyway, perhaps because grown people had a weakness for children confessing with sufficient conviction. When they were dismissed at last, shaken but intact, there was no sensible way to return to the polite distance that had existed before the troll. After a creature has tried to smash your skull in, social awkwardness feels frivolous. They ended up in Hagrid's hut, because nowhere else seemed equal to the day. Hagrid made them tea strong enough to revive the dead, and listened with a face that moved between horror and pride. "Shouldn't have been there at all," he said, wiping his eyes as if the steam offended them. "But all the same, good thing you were," Harry asked, because curiosity had been worrying at him since the midnight duel about the three-headed dog. Hagrid brightened at once. "Fluffy? Harmless he is. Long as you know how to treat him. Belongs to me. Well, lent to Professor Dumbledore-like." "To guard what?" Harry asked. Hagrid clamped his mouth shut so suddenly that even Fang looked surprised. "Something," Ron said softly. "Something valuable," Hermione added. "Something," Hagrid repeated stoutly. "That has nothing to do with first years unless to do with nosy ones." That should have ended it. Yet, as they rose to leave, Harry glanced toward the door and saw Snape crossing the dark edge of the grounds, one hand held stiffly near a trouser leg that appeared torn. The memory of Fluffy's fangs bloomed in his mind with clean, dangerous logic. It was the first time he wondered whether the thing beneath the trapdoor might not merely be guarded against strangers. It might be guarded against someone inside the castle already trying to reach it. The first Quidditch match of the season was against Gryffindor, which would have been uncomfortable under any circumstances. In Harry's case, it threatened to become an educational catastrophe. Terrence Higgs, Slytherin's regular seeker, twisted his wrist in a rain-slick practice 2 days before the game. Marcus Flint, after swearing with such artistry that even the older Slytherins listened respectfully, named Harry as replacement and told him that if he embarrassed the house he could fly home on his own broom. The news traveled faster than any owl. Gryffindor received it as betrayal, compounded by insult. Slytherin received it as proof that destiny, when properly cultivated, naturally wore green. Only Ron seemed able to find the ridiculousness in all of it. "Oliver Wood looks like he wants to write you a personal letter on sportsmanship, and then set fire to it," he reported cheerfully after a Gryffindor practice. Hermione, who disapproved equally of house politics and broken necks, spent the week hovering between the pitch and the library, with a face suggesting that friendship across rival teams might be illegal, but she intended to test the statute. The morning of the match dawned hard and bright. The stands shivered with banners. Lee Jordan's commentary crackled through the air with partisan enthusiasm, thinly disguised as professionalism. Flint clapped Harry once on the shoulder and told him to catch the snitch or die usefully. For the first several minutes, the game was too fast for thought. Bludgers screamed past. Chasers collided in a whirl of robes and elbows. Harry saw little of the snitch and far too much of the ground. Then his broom gave a savage jerk beneath him. He corrected automatically. The broom jerked again, harder. A cold spike of alarm ran through him. This was no ordinary imbalance. The handle tried to twist out of his grip. One foot slipped. The crowd below became a blur of color and open mouths. Harry clung on and forced himself not to look down. Panic would only help whatever was doing this. From the stands, Hermione Granger was already on her feet, scanning the teachers rather than the sky. She saw Snape staring fixedly at Harry, lips moving in a mutter, and reached the most obvious conclusion. Ron followed her with all the hesitation of a loyal catastrophe. By the time either of them reached the row of professors, Quirrell had also half risen, face strange beneath his turban, but no one was looking at him. Hermione's shoulder struck Snape as she forced her way past. A moment later, blue fire leapt up around the hem of his robes. Snape sprang to his feet with a curse that made 3 nearby third-years gasp in admiration. The muttering stopped, Snape's because he was stamping out flames, Quirrell's because the panic in the row had broken his concentration. Harry's broom steadied at once. He did not know why. He knew only that he had perhaps 10 seconds before the adults below sorted themselves out. and that the tiny flash of gold near the Gryffindor goalposts had chosen a lovely time to become visible. He dropped into a dive so sharp the wind cut water from his eyes, and the crowd became one long shout. Wood streaked past him trying to intercept. Harry flattened himself to the broom, reached, and closed his hand around the snitch inches above the turf. The Slytherin stands exploded. Flint lifted Harry onto his shoulders before he had fully remembered how to stand. Pansy screamed herself hoarse. Draco looked as though he had swallowed admiration and found it bitter. Across the pitch, the Gryffindors wore the mixed expressions of people uncertain whether to applaud bravery, resent treachery, or write a ballad about poor judgment. Ron, catching Harry's eye, settled for punching the air. Hermione only mouthed, "Are you mad?" with tears of delayed fright glittering in her eyes. It was Hagrid who deepened the mystery afterward. He found the three of them arguing in an empty classroom and listened, arms folded, while Hermione insisted Snape had been jinxing Harry. Ron swore Snape had looked murderous all term, and Harry said only that his broom had not felt like bad weather. "Professor Snape wouldn't try to kill you," Hagrid said at last, scandalized. "Then what was he doing?" Harry demanded. Hagrid hesitated. Harry saw the moment caution lose to affection. "Protecting ya, more like, if ya ask me. Didn't trust Quirrell after all that business on Halloween, did he? And he has had his eyes on that corridor ever since Fluffy took a piece o' his leg." The classroom went still. "Fluffy," Hermione repeated. Hagrid shut his mouth too late. "Blast. That dog is yours," Harry said. "Borrowed him," Hagrid muttered. "And you lot know too much already." "What's he guarding?" Ron asked. "I shouldn't say." "Who from?" Hermione said. Hagrid's big hands twisted together. "From anyone who shouldn't have it." There was no sense taking the answer by force. Hagrid's loyalty could outlast a siege. Yet Harry walked back to the castle with a certainty that pressed against his ribs from the inside. Whatever lay under the trapdoor mattered enough for Dumbledore to protect it, for Hagrid to lend a monster, for Snape to be bitten while apparently trying to defend it, and for someone perhaps timid, perhaps hidden, perhaps cleverer than the school believed, to try reaching it in secret. Snow came early that year. By the time the grounds turned white, Harry was thinking of the trapdoor almost as often as he thought of home, which was a dismal achievement. He told himself the curiosity was practical. He had learned, after all, that Hogwarts concealed dangerous things poorly and explained them worse. But beneath that reason lay another, the feeling that the castle was circling some larger truth, and that he, by accident or design, had already stepped into its orbit. When Christmas arrived, the mystery came with him into the quiet. Hogwarts at Christmas felt less like a school than a secret somebody had decided to be generous enough to share. The corridors emptied of swagger and noise. Armor stood listening in peace. Snow silvered the grounds beyond the mullioned windows, and the great hall blazed each evening with candlelight reflected in baubles large as apples. For the first time in his life, Harry discovered that silence could be warm. Most of Slytherin went home. Draco departed beneath a cloud of polished luggage and family expectation, pausing only to inform Harry that Christmas at Malfoy Manor would contain better wine than Hogwarts was fit to store, and fewer Weasleys than any civilized holiday required. Pansy left. Crabbe and Goyle lumbered after their fathers. The common room thinned to a handful of boys who preferred the castle's liberties to their family scrutiny. Harry was one of them because Privet Drive waited at the other end of the train. On Christmas morning, he woke in his four-poster beneath emerald curtains to the unfamiliar fact of gifts. The first was a knitted jumper in a rich, slightly crooked green, with a silver H stitched into the front. There was no note, only the smell of clean wool and the unmistakable warmth of a handmade thing. Ron, meeting him later by the fire, wore a maroon one, and looked embarrassed enough to die when Harry understood. "Mum said you couldn't exactly be left out because of assorting," Ron muttered. Harry ran a thumb over the knitted letter, and had to look away before anyone noticed too much on his face. Hagrid had sent a roughly carved wooden flute, crooked but earnest. Hermione's gift was a packet of sugar quills, and a note reminding him that holidays were an excellent time to improve one's essays. The last present lay hidden at the bottom of the pile in silver-gray folds that slid like water over his hands. The note with it contained only 2 lines. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." The invisibility cloak changed Christmas from pleasant to dangerous. Harry lasted until midnight. He had not forgotten the forbidden corridor, Snape's torn leg, or the unanswered question of what required such layers of protection. Under the cloak, the castle became both intimate and enormous, its secrets breathing at the edge of vision. He slipped past portraits, Filch, and once Professor Snape gliding through a torchlit passage with the expression of a man arguing with himself in Latin. The restricted section of the library admitted him reluctantly. Dust rose in old, accusing ghosts. He had barely opened one heavy volume when a scream from somewhere beyond the shelves, Filch's cat perhaps, or only his imagination, sent him stumbling deeper into the dark. He did not find the answer that night. He found the mirror instead. It stood in an abandoned classroom beneath a drape of black cloth, taller than any man and framed in tarnished gold. The inscription along the top meant nothing to him. His own reflection meant less. Then the glass changed. His mother stood beside him first, slim and bright-eyed, her face so alive with love that it undid him at once. His father stood on the other side, untidy hair refusing any order. Behind them gathered figures he did not know and knew absolutely. Grandparents, perhaps, or the kinds of relatives no child notices until he has been denied them. They were all looking at him as if he were the thing they had wanted all along. No one in the mirror cared what house tie he wore. No one wondered what darker qualities the hat had recognized. He was simply theirs, and they were his. Harry did not remember walking to the glass. He only knew that his hand met cold surface where warmth should have been. He returned the next night, and the night after that. Ron came once beneath the cloak and saw something entirely different. Himself older, triumphant, head boy and Quidditch captain, and shining with the kind of future Ron rarely dared imagine aloud. They argued in whispers over whose vision mattered more, which was another way of saying both of them wanted to stay. Dumbledore ended it. Harry found the headmaster waiting beside the mirror on the 4th night, moonlight catching in his beard like frost. He was not angry. In some ways that made the encounter harder. "It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts," Dumbledore said when Harry admitted what he had seen. Harry stared at the glass. "Then why have it at all?" "Because desire is not evil," Dumbledore said softly. "But living inside it can be." He told Harry the mirror would be moved and advised him, with a gentleness more serious than a rebuke, not to seek it again. The old man's eyes rested for a moment on the silver H stitched into Harry's jumper, then on the green light of the cloak pooled around his shoes. "It is a hard thing," Dumbledore said, "to want 2 opposite kinds of belonging at once." Harry looked up sharply, but the headmaster only smiled and stepped aside for him to leave. Back in the Slytherin dormitory, with the lake pressing darkly beyond the walls, Harry lay awake for hours. The mirror had shown him what he lacked, but also what he feared. That part of his deepest wish was not merely to know his parents. It was to be known by someone so completely that he would not have to negotiate, charm, defend, or perform his way into place after place for the rest of his life. When term resumed, the mystery of the trapdoor returned as well. Yet now it was tangled with something quieter and more dangerous. Harry had seen the shape of his own hunger. He could no longer pretend not to understand why certain kinds of power tempted lonely people most of all. The dragon egg arrived on a wet night in February and ought, by all ordinary laws of the world, to have been Harry's first warning that Hagrid had again made a friend in a pub who would later prove disastrous. Instead, Harry only noticed how odd Hagrid sounded at breakfast the next morning, distracted, beaming, and trying too hard not to beam. By afternoon, the secret had dragged him, Ron, and Hermione down to the gamekeeper's hut, where a black egg the size of a football sat in the fire like a bad idea pretending to be furniture. "I won it," Hagrid said with the humility of a man who wished very much to be congratulated. Off a stranger, hood up like, knew a fair bit about creatures. Harry's attention sharpened. Did he know about Fluffy too? Hagrid looked guilty for one disastrous second and then overcompensated with bluster. Lots of folk know I'm into unusual animals. The egg cracked that evening. What emerged looked less like a baby than a blade trying to remember how to be alive. Hagrid fell in love on sight. Ron named the relevant books. Hermione named the laws being broken. Harry, watching the little dragon blink amber eyes in the hearthlight, felt a flash of recognition so sudden it nearly embarrassed him. The creature had arrived in the wrong place, frightening on first impression, mistrusted before it had done anything except exist. He found himself holding out a gloved finger. Norbert, as Hagrid christened him, bit the glove with hopeful ferocity. Keeping a dragon secret at a boarding school turned out to be difficult even before Draco Malfoy noticed. He came to Hagrid's hut under the pretext of returning a borrowed knife, and stopped dead on the threshold as Norbert sneezed smoke from the table. The look on Draco's face was not simple triumph. It contained outrage too, and something wounded beneath that. You told them, he said to Harry later in the corridor, meaning the Gryffindors, meaning secrets shared beyond house lines, meaning a dozen smaller betrayals accumulated over months. And not me. Harry could have lied. Instead, he said, you would have told your father before supper. Draco's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Only because somebody in this house ought to remember what loyalty looks like. Ron's hand, bitten while helping Hagrid feed the dragon, swelled alarmingly and landed him in the hospital wing. That left Harry and Hermione carry out the rescue plan once Charlie Weasley's friends agreed to collect Norbert from the astronomy tower after midnight. They used the invisibility cloak, dragon bundled in a crate that jerked and hissed every time it smelled fresh air. Neville intercepted them on a landing, wild-eyed and earnest. Malfoy's told someone, he whispered. I heard him. He set a trap. No. The words were scarcely out when Mrs. Norris shrieked from the darkness, and McGonagall's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. In the chaos that followed, Charlie's friends took the crate and vanished skyward exactly as planned. Harry, Hermione, and Neville were not so fortunate. McGonagall's fury was magnificent. Out of bed, out of bounds, carrying. She broke off, perhaps because even she could not publicly identify the vanished cargo without creating paperwork beyond endurance. I have rarely heard of such flagrant irresponsibility. Draco, dragged from behind a suit of armor by Filch with an expression of injured innocence, attempted at once to redirect blame toward Harry. It worked only well enough to implicate himself. The deductions fell like an executioner's axe. 50 points from Harry Potter. 50 from Hermione Granger. 50 from Neville Longbottom for assisting and concealing. 20 from Draco Malfoy for attempting to lure fellow students into trouble while breaking curfew himself. The arithmetic mattered less than the silence that followed. Harry watched the numbers slide down the giant emerald hourglass in the entrance hall the next morning, and felt for perhaps the first time all year the full weight of belonging to Slytherin rather than merely residing there. He had not merely cost them points. He had cost them victory. The common room received him with a coldness more complete than open hatred. Older students stopped speaking when he entered. Pansy Parkinson looked through him as though he were badly arranged furniture. Terence Higgs muttered that Flint should never have put faith in a boy who preferred Gryffindor company. Even those who had once valued Harry as a house emblem now seemed to find the symbol expensive to maintain. Draco did not gloat. That would almost have been kinder. He regarded Harry across the fire as one might regard a nobleman who had married beneath himself and acted shocked when society noticed. You could have asked for help, he said at last. Harry was too tired to pretend not to understand. From whom? From us. The answer angered Harry precisely because some small part of him had wanted it. Wanted the house that claimed him to care about anything except points, blood, and victory. Wanted Draco's loyalty to have been large enough to survive being contradicted. Wanted impossible things, in short, which Hogwarts had proved again and again was a dangerous habit. Instead, he said, I did ask for help, You just disapproved of who answered." He went to bed hearing the murmur follow him through the stone room like a tide withdrawing from a ruined shore. Living in disgrace was a skill Harry had first learned at Privet Drive, but there was a particular misery in enduring it inside the same stone walls as the people doing the condemning. At Privet Drive, one could at least flee to the back garden, the cupboard, the far end of a table. At Hogwarts, there was nowhere to go that did not belong, in some degree, to the castle and its chosen arrangements. He found that he missed Ron's untidy loyalty and Hermione's relentless reason with an ache sharper than he would once have thought possible. They met him anyway, in alcoves and empty classrooms, and once in the owlery with the wind needling through the slats, as if friendship were a thing that could cross any number of staircases, provided those involved were stubborn enough. Hagrid, when he learned what his loose tongue had cost them, looked so stricken that Harry could not bear to make the gamekeeper feel worse. Draco, by contrast, had no such difficulty. "You might have remembered what house you belonged to," he said one night in the common room, the fire painting copper along his pale hair. His tone was mild, but half the room was listening. "There are rules. There are priorities." Harry, who had spent the day being ignored by boys who had once slapped his shoulder after Quidditch, looked at him across the green shadow of the room. "You mean the cup?" A faint flush rose in Draco's cheeks. "I mean Slytherin." "No," Harry said. "You mean the cup. There's a difference." The silence after that was as fine and dangerous as spun glass. Draco's expression did not break. It simply cooled, 1 degree at a time, into something more careful than dislike. Detention came in June, at 11 o'clock at night, because McGonagall believed strongly in moral instruction delivered through exhaustion and fear. Harry arrived at the entrance hall with Hermione and Neville, who seemed astonished still to be alive after a year at Hogwarts, and Draco, who had evidently spent the walk downstairs composing speeches about the indignity of punishment. Filch met them with a lantern and a face like a delighted vulture, then handed them off to Hagrid at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The trees rose black against a sky scrubbed bright with stars. Fang pressed close to Hagrid's leg and whined. "There's Summit in there killing unicorns," Hagrid told them in a low voice, as if the forest itself might overhear and take offense. "Wounded one not long ago and another dead tonight. We're going to find it." Draco's outrage vanished. "At night? That's usually when dark things are up to dark things," Hagrid said reasonably. Silver blood gleamed among the roots once they entered the forest, bright as moonlight and wrong in a way that made Harry's skin creep. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. The silence did not feel empty. It felt listening. When the trails split, Hagrid divided them. Harry found himself with Draco and Fang, following a thread of silver that dragged in droplets over leaves and moss. Draco kept muttering that his father would hear of this, that no school in Britain would dare, that unicorn blood was worth a fortune and someone ought to send for proper authorities. Harry let the words wash past him. His scar had begun to prickle. The sensation intensified the farther they walked, until every shadow seemed to lean toward him. Then they found the clearing. A unicorn lay there on its side, pearly hide spoiled by death, one foreleg bent unnaturally beneath it. Kneeling over the body was something hooded and dark, more absence than shape. Its head lifted at the sound of Fang's startled yelp. Harry saw a mouth shining wetly silver. The pain in his scar went white-hot. He stumbled backward with a cry. Draco shouted. The hooded figure rose, gliding rather than stepping, and moved toward them with a horrible purpose that made Harry's limbs lock. Draco's nerves shattered first. He turned and ran, crashing through bracken, Fang bolting after him. Harry was alone. The figure came on. Then hooves struck earth like drum beats, and something pale surged between Harry and the hooded thing. There was a flash of a blonde human torso, a white horse's flank, a bow lifted like judgment. The creature hissed and fled into the trees. Harry collapsed against a trunk, hand clamped to his scar. The centaur who had saved him turned his grave blue eyes upon him. "You are the Potter boy," he said. "You should not be here." Harry dragged in breath after breath. What was that? The centaur looked toward the darkness where the thing had vanished. A creature reduced to a half-life, one that will do anything, disgrace anything to continue a little longer. Unicorn blood will keep such a being alive, though at a terrible cost. Harry thought of the Gringotts break-in, of the trapdoor, of the thing under the dog, and a fear colder than the night spread through him. Voldemort, he whispered. The centaur's ears flicked. Names matter less than choices. But, yes, you are near the heart of a very old hunt. More centaurs arrived. One dark and severe, another older and restless-eyed, and they argued in low, furious tones about stars, interference, Mars burning bright above the trees. Harry understood little except that they were angry with the one called Firenze for rescuing him, and that the forest knew more than Hogwarts did. When Hagrid finally found them, booming in alarm and brandishing his crossbow, Harry let himself be led back through the trees with shaking legs and a mind full of dreadful clarity. Someone was trying to steal the thing under the trapdoor because someone, perhaps not yet fully alive, but not gone either, needed it desperately enough to drink the blood of a unicorn. Back in the castle, Ron and Hermione listened in appalled silence while Harry recounted the clearing, the hooded figure, Firenze's warning. Ron went gray around the mouth. Hermione pressed her fingers hard to her temples, as if the facts might arrange themselves more kindly under pressure. "The stone," she said at last. "If it is the Philosopher's stone, if it really makes the elixir of life, then he doesn't need to come back strong all at once," Harry said. "He only needs enough." No one slept much that night. Harry returned to the Slytherin dormitory just before dawn, slipped between his curtains, and lay staring at the faint green light under the hangings. The coldness of the house still surrounded him, but it had shrunk. House points, Quidditch rivalries, Draco's opinions, none of it vanished, yet all at once it seemed part of a much smaller world than the one he had glimpsed in the forest. For the first time since the sorting, Harry no longer cared very much whether Slytherin approved of him. He cared what Slytherin might become if boys like Draco were allowed to decide, unopposed, what approval meant. The answer, when it came, had been in Harry's trunk for months. He found it on the evening after the forest, sleepless and turning restlessly through the few possessions he considered his, until his hand brushed the stack of chocolate frog cards Ron had insisted he keep. Dumbledore's face winked up at him, absent-minded and wise, and beneath the portrait Harry read the line he had skimmed a dozen times without understanding it. Particularly famous for his work with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. He was halfway to the library before he remembered he ought to be tired. Hermione arrived breathless 5 minutes later, summoned by whispered message and the promise of relevance. Ron came after, hair sticking up in all directions and tie crooked, grumbling until Hermione thrust the card under his nose, and his eyes went wide. Flamel turned out to be not merely real but ancient, an alchemist tied to only one object in the wizarding world, significant enough to hide beneath a trapdoor guarded by a three-headed dog. They found the reference buried in a heavy library book that smelled of dust and old glue. The Philosopher's Stone. Capable of turning metal to gold. Capable, far more importantly, of producing the elixir of life. He was protecting it from the break-in, Hermione said, tracing the passage with one finger. Hagrid took it from Gringotts because Dumbledore told him to. And Snape's after it, Ron said darkly. But Harry, thinking of the forest and Quirrell's frightened face and Snape's strange, angry watchfulness, was no longer quite so certain. Suspicion remained. Habit made that difficult to lay down. Yet a doubt had entered it. He began to watch more carefully. What he saw in the days that followed only muddled the matter. Snape did indeed corner Quirrell in a corridor one afternoon so deserted that the sound of their voices carried clearly into the statue alcove where Harry stood hidden under the cloak. Snape's tone was dangerous. Quirrell's was thin with panic. "You know what is expected," Snape said. I don't know what you mean. You have had enough time to decide where you stand." That sounded like a threat. It also sounded inconveniently, like the kind of pressure one might place on a weak ally rather than a co-conspirator. Quirrell all but fled when Snape's robes brushed his. Harry remained where he was, frowning into the darkness long after both men had gone. Exams arrived as if the castle had chosen to stage its own little apocalypse in parchment. Hermione revised with a terrifying serenity. Ron revised like a condemned man. Harry did more honestly than either expected, owing as much to Snape's relentless standards as to his own effort. But every spare thought still circled the stone. The sense of impending action grew in him day by day, fed by Quirrell's increasingly hunted expression and Hagrid's guilty inability to meet his eye. It was Hagrid who broke at last. Harry, Ron, and Hermione visited the hut after their final exam to make certain the gamekeeper had not, in a fit of remorse, told anyone else even more than he had told the stranger in the pub. Hagrid denied everything stoutly. Then Hermione asked how anyone could ever get past Fluffy, and Hagrid, indignant at the implication that his dog was less than a masterpiece, forgot caution in favor of professional pride. "Music," he said. "Just a bit. Play Summon and he's asleep before he can blink." The moment the word left his mouth, he froze. Harry felt the world tighten. "Who asked you that?" he said. Hagrid stared at them, horror dawning in increments. "A bloke in the pub," he muttered. "Wanted to know about magical creatures like. Seemed interested in dogs. I shouldn't said." But Harry barely heard the rest. A memory struck him with perfect force. The odd agitation in the castle that morning. An owl to Dumbledore at breakfast. The headmaster rising at once and leaving. Then, half an hour later, McGonagall mentioning briskly to another professor that Dumbledore had been summoned to London on urgent ministry business. A summons that could be faked. "He's gone tonight," Harry said. Ron stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Then this is it." Hermione went pale, but only briefly. "We should tell a teacher." "We tell which one?" Harry demanded. "McGonagall thinks we're inventing half of it. Snape may or may not be blackmailing Quirrell. By the time anyone believes us, it'll be done." This was not entirely fair to McGonagall, and some part of him knew it. But urgency had already taken hold, and with it came the old, fierce knowledge that adults often noticed danger only after children had been forced to stand in it. They agreed with frightening speed. Harry returned to the castle for the cloak and nearly ran into Draco at the mouth of the Slytherin corridor. Draco looked at the bundle under Harry's arm, then at Harry's face, and something sharp lit in his eyes. "You're going somewhere," he said. Harry did not bother with a convincing lie. "Yes." "At night. Again." "Yes." Draco's mouth tightened. "You cannot keep deciding that house rules don't apply to you whenever you feel like being noble." Harry stopped. It was the first time Draco had used the word as an accusation. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I just refuse to let the wrong people decide what counts as loyalty." Draco stared at him, color rising. For an instant, Harry thought he would call after him, summon the prefect, do something irrevocable. Instead, he said, very coldly, "If you lose us the cup twice in 1 year, Potter, you'll wish you'd met the troll first." Harry left him in the corridor and did not look back. Meeting Ron and Hermione was harder. Neville, raw-nerved after a year of broken bones, lost passwords, and too many points vanishing from Gryffindor, found them creeping through the common room and planted himself before the portrait hole with both hands spread. "I'm not letting you out," he said, voice shaking and face stubborn. "You'll get us into trouble again," Hermione begged. Ron argued. Neville stood his ground with the simple, immovable courage of a person who has spent most of his life being underestimated and has just discovered he hates it. In the end, Hermione whispered the body-bind curse with tears of apology in her eyes, and Neville toppled stiffly to the floor, furious and helpless and braver than any of them had a right to require. By the time Harry, hidden under the cloak, joined Ron and Hermione on the dark third-floor corridor, there was no room left inside any of them for doubt. Fluffy lay behind the locked door, all three heads drooping in unnatural sleep to the thin lingering notes of Hagrid's flute. Beneath those paws, the trapdoor stood ajar. Harry looked once at Ron and Hermione. Hermione's face was bloodless with fear and set with purpose. Ron swallowed hard, nodded, and tried for a grin that did not entirely fail. Harry pulled the trapdoor open the rest of the way and looked down into blackness. Then he jumped. The fall ended in cold, living rope. Harry hit a tangle of vines that tightened at once around wrists, ankles, ribs. Ron crashed nearby with a curse. Hermione vanished altogether in a mass of thrashing green. For one mad instant, Harry thought the trap had cushioned them kindly. Then the plant began to squeeze. "Don't fight it," Hermione gasped from somewhere below them, maddeningly analytical even while being strangled. "It likes that." Ron, already panicking, fought harder. The vines responded with enthusiasm. Harry forced himself still. It went against every instinct he owned. Yet Slytherin had taught him, if nothing else, that panic was often a gift handed to the enemy. He went limp, breath shallow, and felt the plant hesitate. A heartbeat later, heat blazed through the roots beneath him. Hermione, pinned half flat and furious with concentration, had managed bluebell flames. The snare recoiled. They dropped free in a smoking heap onto solid ground. The next chamber contained wing beats and sky. 100 keys darted through the air in glittering circles above brooms lined against the wall. On the far side stood a locked door, its keyhole shaped in the image of a wing. Harry understood at once and did not waste time saying so. He mounted. The broom beneath him was school quality, clumsy and loyal, but the air received him like an old bargain. "Which one?" Ron shouted from below. Harry rose fast, eyes narrowing against the metallic glitter. Most of the keys were ordinary brass or silver. One was bright blue, with one bent wing as though it had been caught once and damaged. The memory of Flint's training flashed through him, not the speed, the pattern. Watch for the hesitation. There is always one creature in the flock that flinches differently. He stooped, nearly collided with a swarm. Rolled, reached, missed, cursed, dove again. The key clipped his ear. He wheeled, trapped it against the wall with his body, and snatched it in one bruising grab. Minutes later, they were through and standing before a giant chessboard whose pieces towered above them, carved and armed for battle. Ron went very still. "This," he said in a voice approaching reverence, "is wizard's chess too." Harry had played enough with him by then to understand the tone. Ron moved among the pieces with his head tilted, reading the board as if the Stone Knights whispered their intentions directly into his ear. He placed Hermione as a bishop, Harry as a castle, and himself astride a knight. Then he began to command. The game was savage. Pieces exploded in showers of rock. Horses reared. Bishops cleaved one another in half. Harry obeyed Ron's shouted orders with the unnerving sensation of being inside someone else's brilliant mind. 6 moves from the end, Ron's face changed. "There's only one way," he said. Hermione understood before Harry did. No. Ron's mouth twitched. "It's all right, you two have to get through." Before either of them could stop him, he gave the order. The Black Queen descended like vengeance and struck Ron from his knight with such force that Harry's stomach lurched. Ron hit the ground and did not move. "Go!" Hermione cried, and because staying would ruin what Ron had done, Harry went. The next chamber held only an unconscious troll sprawled on its face and stinking up the room. "Quirrell," Hermione breathed, all illusions about timid incompetence gone at last. Beyond the troll lay a table of 7 potion bottles before black and purple fire. Hermione read the logic aloud once, twice, then her eyes flashed. "I can solve it." Harry, half wild with fear for Ron, forced himself to listen. Hermione moved the bottles into order with trembling hands. One carried them forward through the black flames. One would take a person back. The rest were poison or nettle wine. "There's only enough of the forward potion for one," she said. The truth of it crashed between them. Harry looked back toward the chambers behind them. Ron unconscious, perhaps worse, the troll, the chessman, the snare. and knew there was no time to argue the point. "You go back," he said. "Help Ron. Fetch Hermione. I am Hermione." Despite everything, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Fetch help," he corrected. "Get Dumbledore if he's back. Get anyone who can stop what's happening." Her eyes shone with frightened fury. "Be careful." Harry drank. Cold raced through him like a blade sliding under skin. He stepped through the black fire and entered the final chamber. It was smaller than he expected. Quiet, too. No treasure, no altar, no dais of impossible magic. Only the mirror veerized standing in the far corner, its gilt frame dim in the torchlight, and Quirrell beside it with his back to Harry. The professor turned. Without the turban's fussy height, he seemed barer, younger, and somehow more dangerous. Whatever stammering weakness had once defined him was gone. His eyes were fever-bright. "You," he said, and smiled. I wondered whether it would be Snape or the boy. All the pieces slid into place so quickly, Harry almost reeled. "Snape was trying to stop me," Quirrell said with disgust. "A tiresome man. Suspicious. Loyal in such inconvenient directions, but not clever enough in the right ways." Harry's hand went to his wand. Quirrell's was already raised. "Oh, you may keep that for now. There is little use in pretense between us. Come here, Potter." Harry did not move. His scar burned like a brand. "Do you know," Quirrell went on almost conversationally, "what a disappointment you were to so many people? The savior of the wizarding world, seated among serpents, and yet you failed to become what any sensible observer would have predicted. I thought your house might make you practical. Instead, you chose sentimental company and inconvenient scruples." "No." Harry's mind was racing. If Quirrell needed the mirror, he did not yet have what he wanted. That meant Harry still had time, if time could be made from fear and questions. "So you sent the troll," he said, "and cursed my broom." "Yes. Though I'll admit the broom should have finished you. You are distressingly difficult to kill." Quirrell's smile thinned. "Perhaps that will please him." The voice that answered did not come from the room. It came from Quirrell, or rather from behind Quirrell within him, layered under the professor's own like something long buried and now speaking through damp soil. "Use the boy." Quirrell's face altered with reverence and terror. Slowly, with hands that shook, he turned around. On the back of his head, where hair should have lain flat, there was a face. It was less a face than the memory of one preserved in hatred, flat and pale and terrible, eyes red dark and unwinking, nostrils like slits, mouth thin as a wound. Harry stared. Everything in him wanted to recoil. Instead, he found himself caught by the thought that this ruined thing, this fragment clinging to another man's skull, had once terrified a world. "So," whispered the face, "the boy in Slytherin. I expected more." Harry's fear sharpened into something cleaner. Anger, perhaps. Not hot anger. He had learned early that hot anger got one laughed at by Dudley and ignored by Vernon. This was colder. This was the fury of being assessed and weighed again by someone who thought he understood what Harry ought to have become. "I didn't come here to impress you," Harry said. A breath that might have been a laugh stirred Quirrell's robes. "Look into the mirror," the face commanded. "Tell me what you see." Harry stepped before the glass. For one sick moment he feared it would show him his parents again and undo him. Instead, the reflection shifted almost at once. He saw himself, pale and drawn, reaching into his pocket and drawing out a small red stone. In the mirror self's face there was no triumph, only grim relief. Then the image winked and was gone. Something solid dropped into Harry's real pocket. He did not move a muscle. "Well?" hissed the voice. Harry let his gaze remain fixed on the mirror. "I see myself shaking hands with you," he lied, the words tasting filthy, "and being given great power." Quirrell inhaled sharply, hungry enough to believe it and clever enough to doubt. "What kind of power?" Harry shrugged with as much disdain as he could summon. That seems like the sort of detail a person would keep to himself. Rage flashed over Quirrell's face. The one on the back of his head spoke more coldly. He lies. Seize him. Quirrell lunged. Harry dodged sideways. The room exploded into motion. Quirrell caught his wrist, and the moment skin touched skin he screamed. Not in triumph, in agony. Blisters erupted where his fingers closed over Harry. Smoke curled from them. Quirrell stared, wild-eyed, then grabbed for Harry again with the other hand. That one burned too, the flesh blackening on contact. Harry had no time to understand. Instinct took over. He drove forward, clutching Quirrell anywhere he could reach. Face, arm, neck. While the professor shrieked and flailed and the terrible face on the back of his head raged in voices that seemed to fill the chamber. "Kill him, fool! Kill him!" Harry's scar was splitting him in two. The room reeled. He held on because letting go felt like death, and because somewhere under the pain was the memory of Dumbledore's calm, of his mother in the mirror, of all the people who had chosen him, not because of fame or usefulness, but because they loved him or trusted him, or simply came when he ran toward danger alone. Quirrell's strength failed first. He convulsed, tore himself loose, and fell backward, clawing at his own ruined skin. Harry staggered after him, blind with pain. The torches spun into wheels of fire. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was a high, furious voice filled with old hatred and thwarted hunger, slipping away like smoke through a crack. Then the blackness rose and swallowed everything. When Harry woke, the first thing he saw was white linen. The second was sunlight. For several bewildered moments he lay perfectly still, listening to the soft, familiar noises of the hospital wing and feeling the strange, blessed fact of pain reduced to something human-sized again. Then a chair scraped, and Ron's face swung into view, freckled and anxious and cracked open by relief. "You great idiot," Ron said thickly. Hermione made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "He's been awake for half a second. That's all he needs to know." Harry tried to sit up. Madame Pomfrey, materializing with the supernatural speed of all expert healers and angry hens, shoved him flat again and told him in no uncertain terms that if he tore anything she had mended, she would personally break it once more for symmetry. Later, when Ron and Hermione had been driven out long enough for Harry to swallow broth and potion under protest, Dumbledore came. He sat beside the bed with the air of a man arriving exactly when he means to. Never earlier, never later. For a while he asked ordinary questions in an ordinary voice. Whether Harry was in pain, whether he wanted more water, whether the light bothered him. It was so unlike the expected grand reckoning that Harry nearly laughed. Finally he said, "You have some questions." Harry stared at the blanket. "A few." "Then let us see whether I deserve to answer them." It all came out less coherently than Harry intended. Quirrell, the mirror, Snape, the burning touch, the face on the back of the head, the stone. When he finished, Dumbledore folded his hands over the top of his wand and looked at him with the sort of deep attention that made lying feel both pointless and unappealing. "Professor Snape," he said, "was trying to save your life on more than one occasion. His feelings toward your father were and remain complicated, but debts matter to him. Your father once saved him, and Severus does not forget." Harry absorbed that in silence. It explained less than Dumbledore perhaps thought and more than Harry had expected. "As for Quirrell," Dumbledore went on, "he was weak where another man was vain, and so he made himself useful to evil. That often looks like cleverness at the time." Harry hesitated, then asked the question that had been waiting under all the others since the Sorting Hat's voice first whispered in his ear. "Did the hat make a mistake?" Dumbledore's brows lifted slightly. "By putting you in Slytherin?" Harry nodded. The headmaster's expression grew very quiet. "No," he said at length, "but neither was it the whole truth about you. Houses are ways of reading a child, not sentences passed upon one. Slytherin saw your hunger to survive, your gift for understanding danger, your refusal to stay powerless. Those are real things. They need not belong to darkness unless darkness is what you choose to serve. No. Harry looked away at the bright square of window. Most people seem to think they do. Most people, said Dumbledore mildly, prefer categories that excuse them from thinking further. There was a pause. Then, softer. It may be harder for you where you are. Harry gave a short laugh that held no amusement. That's one word for it. Dumbledore's gaze rested on him with something like regret. And yet, he said, there is value in being the contradiction a place has not prepared itself to meet. Before he left, Harry asked about the stone. Dumbledore told him it had been destroyed, that Nicholas and Perenelle Flamel had agreed the time had come, and that some goodbyes were best made before fear forced them from one. Harry thought then of the hooded figure in the forest and understood dimly that immortality pursued for its own sake might be the saddest ambition in the world. The end-of-year feast arrived warm and bright, summer pressing against the castle windows. When Harry entered the great hall at Ron and Hermione's side, conversation lifted, stalled, and broke around him in waves. Emerald and silver banners already hung from the walls. Slytherin had led going into the feast and, with Harry's point still part of its tally, still led now. The table watched him with a new expression. Not affection. Not exactly. The older students had not forgotten the points he had cost them, nor the year he had spent refusing to fit neatly into their expectations. But there was respect there now, reluctant in some faces, unmistakable in others. Even the coldest understood what it meant that a Slytherin had stood between the school and the Dark Lord, and chosen neither profit nor prestige. Draco was seated halfway down the table, immaculate as ever. When Harry looked at him, Draco inclined his head the tiniest amount, an acknowledgement too formal to be friendship and too honest to be mockery. At the high table, Snape did not meet Harry's eyes. Yet when the applause began later, his hands moved once, twice, in controlled accompaniment before stilling again. Dumbledore rose to speak. The feast quieted under the ease of his presence. He praised the year in broad terms, mentioned Quidditch, examinations, certain adventures, better not repeated, and then turned, with deliberate brightness, to the house cup. Slytherin's total was announced to a cheer that rang louder than usual because it had seemed in doubt so many times before. Then Dumbledore, his eyes glinting, said there were some late points to be awarded. To Hermione for the coolest use of logic under pressure that Hogwarts had seen from a first year in a very long time. To Ron for a game of chess so brave and brilliant that older students began at once arguing whether they could have done better. To Neville for the rare courage required to stand against one's friends when one sincerely believes them wrong. And to Harry for nerve, resourcefulness, and an act of loyalty that had protected not only his friends, but the whole school. The great hall shook with applause. Gryffindor roared itself hoarse. Hufflepuff joined in as Hufflepuff always did when decency won anything. Ravenclaw clapped with intelligent vigor. Slytherin's reaction came slower, more unevenly, as if the house had to decide in real time what story it meant to tell about itself now. Then the students around Harry stood. Not all of them, not at once, but enough. Enough that the applause became, briefly, one sound. When the points settled, Slytherin still held the cup. By a margin narrow enough to sting, wide enough to stand. Harry heard the collective intake of breath that followed. Dumbledore let it hang for a moment before smiling over the hall. "I think," he said, "it does us all good to remember that courage may wear more than one color." No one missed the meaning. That night, in the last hush before trunks were closed and dormitories emptied, Harry stood a while in the Slytherin common room, looking out through the black lake windows. The green light moved over the floor and up the stone chairs. Somewhere deeper in the castle, Peeves was singing a scandalous song about Quirrell's turban. The bloody Baron drifted past in silence, a pale stain in the dark. Harry had arrived in this room a curiosity, then an asset, then a liability. He was leaving it something more complicated than any of those. The house had not changed completely. Neither had he. But a crack had opened. and through it he had seen the possibility that a place built on ambition might yet learn the worth of choosing the right thing before the advantageous one. On the train home, he shared a compartment with Ron and Hermione again, as if the year had folded back to its beginning and remade the arrangement with greater care. Ron fell asleep first, mouth open, one hand still resting on a chess magazine. Hermione read until the light failed, then shut her book and watched the countryside slide by. "You know," she said after a while, "next year will likely be even worse." Harry smiled at the window, where his reflection wore green trim in his mother's eyes. "Probably." Ron snorted awake just long enough to mutter, "Brilliant," and fell back asleep. At the station, as the train slowed and summer rushed in through the cracks around the windows, Harry saw Draco in the corridor dragging his trunk. For a second, the other boy hesitated, then opened the compartment door. "My father," Draco said, not looking at Ron or Hermione, "will want to meet you over the holiday." Harry raised an eyebrow. Draco's mouth thinned. "I didn't say you'd enjoy it." "No," Harry said. "I suppose you didn't." Something like unwilling amusement flickered through Draco's face. He shut the door and moved on. When at last the platform came into view and beyond it, the world that had once seemed the whole of Harry's life, he felt no shrinking. He was not returning unchanged. The cupboard under the stairs existed still. Vernon's mustache, Petunia's pursed mouth, Dudley's heavy fists existed still. But so did broomsticks and hidden chambers and friends who had crossed house lines for him. So did enemies he understood better now. So did the knowledge that power could be used to dominate or to defend, to hoard or to protect, and that the difference lay not in the tool, but the hand and heart behind it. As he lifted his trunk down, the silver serpent on its side caught the light. For the first time, it did not look like a warning. It looked like a challenge Harry meant to answer on his own terms.